Rachel Stevens was 29 years old, a waitress at Sunrise Diner, a modest establishment squeezed between a hardware store and a laundromat in rural Nebraska. Her life moved in predictable circles: wake before dawn, walk 4 blocks through empty streets, tie her worn blue apron around her waist, and greet morning customers with a smile that never betrayed the quiet loneliness beneath. She lived alone in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above the pharmacy, surrounded by photographs that had yellowed with time and memories that felt increasingly distant. Her father had died when she was 15, killed in a training accident at Fort Benning. Her mother passed 2 years later from pneumonia that turned into something worse, something the doctors never quite explained. The aunt who raised her through high school had moved to Arizona for the dry climate, leaving Rachel with little more than birthday cards and occasional phone calls that grew shorter each year. On a Tuesday in early October, Rachel first noticed the boy. He couldn't have been older than 10, small for his age, with watchful eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. He sat in the corner booth farthest from the entrance, a backpack far too large for his thin frame propped beside him, and a book always open on the table in front of him. The first time, he ordered only water. Rachel brought it with a smile and a paper straw. He thanked her with a nod so slight it was almost imperceptible. The second day, the same pattern. The third. The fourth. By the second week, Rachel had mapped his routine with the precision of someone who noticed small things because her own life had taught her how much small things mattered. He arrived at exactly 7:15 each morning, 45 minutes before the elementary school 3 blocks away rang its first bell. He would sit in that same corner booth, reading silently, sipping water so slowly it seemed he was rationing even that. At 7:55 he would close his book, thank her quietly, and leave, having eaten nothing while other customers demolished stacks of pancakes, eggs, bacon, and hash browns. On the 15th day, Rachel made what appeared to be a mistake. She brought him a plate of pancakes, setting it down as if confused by her own actions. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice light. "The kitchen made an extra order by accident. I'll just leave it here instead of throwing it away." The boy looked up, suspicion and hunger warring in his young face. His hands remained flat on the table, unmoving. "It's okay," Rachel reassured him gently. "Sometimes the cook gets orders mixed up. Better someone eats it than it goes to waste, right?" She walked away before he could protest, busying herself behind the counter while watching from the corner of her eye as he hesitantly picked up the fork. When she returned 10 minutes later, the plate was clean, scraped so thoroughly it looked as though it had been washed. The boy's eyes remained fixed on his book with determined intensity, a deliberate avoidance that broke something small inside Rachel's chest. "Thank you," he whispered as she collected the empty plate, his voice barely audible above the diner's morning noise. It became their unspoken arrangement. Each morning, Rachel would bring what she called mistakes or extras: pancakes one day, scrambled eggs and toast the next, oatmeal with brown sugar when the mornings grew colder. The boy never asked for anything, never initiated conversation beyond his quiet thanks, but he ate every bite, sometimes so quickly it seemed he feared the food might vanish if he paused too long. "Who's that kid you keep feeding?" asked Harold, a retired postal worker who occupied the same counter stool every morning, his curiosity finally overcoming his usual reticence. "Don't know," Rachel admitted, refilling his coffee, "but he's hungry." Diane, who worked the grill and had opinions about everything, cornered Rachel in the back after the third week. "You're feeding a stray," she said, not unkindly but with the pragmatism of someone who had watched too many good intentions go wrong. "You give handouts, they never learn gratitude. He'll just disappear one day. They always do." Rachel didn't argue. She simply shrugged and said, "It's fine. I used to be that hungry too." It was the most personal information she'd shared with her coworkers in the 3 years she'd worked at Sunrise Diner. The comment hung in the air for a moment before Diane nodded slowly and returned to the grill without another word. The boy never volunteered his name, and Rachel never asked. Something in his demeanor, the careful way he entered and exited, how he positioned himself to see both the door and the window, told her that questions would only drive him away. Instead, she made sure his water glass stayed full, that the pancakes arrived warm, and that the diner felt like a place where he could breathe easier for 40 minutes each morning. Sometimes, when the morning rush slowed and the boy was absorbed in his reading, Rachel would allow herself to wonder, where did he live? Did he have family? Why was he always alone? And why did hunger seem like such a familiar companion to someone so young? But she always pushed the thoughts away. In her experience, kindness with conditions wasn't kindness at all. It was transaction, and transaction required answers this boy clearly couldn't or wouldn't give. So she continued their silent ritual, watching as the boy's shoulders gradually lowered from their perpetually defensive hunch, as his eyes began to meet hers for a second longer each time she approached his table. That small change, the moment of eye contact that stretched from a millisecond to perhaps two, was enough to convince Rachel that whatever she was doing, however insignificant it might seem, mattered to someone. By the 6th week, others had noticed Rachel's routine with the boy. Most said nothing, but some couldn't resist commenting, their observations laced with the particular cruelty of those who have forgotten what it means to need help. "Playing charity worker on company time?" asked a businessman who frequented the diner, his tone suggesting he found the entire arrangement distasteful and perhaps even offensive to his sense of proper economic order. "Kids these days expect handouts everywhere," remarked another regular customer, shaking his head with the satisfaction of someone whose opinions remain unchallenged. "Times must be changing. In my day, no one gave away free food just because someone looked sad." Rachel heard these comments but let them slide off like rain from a window. She had learned early that defending kindness often hardened the hearts of those who criticized it. However, Frank, the diner's manager, wasn't so easily ignored. He called Rachel into the cramped office behind the kitchen one morning, his expression serious beneath his perpetually furrowed brow. "I've been watching you with that kid," he said, fingers tapping against the laminate desk. "Can't have employees giving away free meals. It's bad for business and sets a precedent I can't afford." Rachel twisted her apron in her hands. "I understand. I'll cover the cost myself." Frank's eyebrows shot up. "From your tips? Those barely cover your rent." "It's my choice," Rachel replied, something resolute in her voice that made Frank study her more carefully, seeing perhaps for the first time the quiet steel beneath her soft demeanor. After a long moment, Frank sighed. "Fine. But if it affects your work, or if that kid causes any trouble, it stops immediately. Understood?" Rachel nodded, relief washing over her. She had anticipated being fired, had spent the previous night mentally preparing for that conversation. But this compromise she could manage. Each morning, she set aside a portion of her tips, money that might have gone toward a new winter coat or the dentist appointment she'd been postponing for 8 months, and paid for the boy's breakfast. On a particularly cold Thursday in November, the boy didn't show up. Rachel found herself checking the door every few minutes, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach like something solid and cold. She prepared his usual plate of pancakes anyway, setting it at his empty booth just in case, unable to break the routine even when logic suggested he wouldn't appear. "Waste of food," Diane muttered as she passed, shaking her head with the vindication of someone whose pessimism had been proven correct. By closing time, the untouched plate had become a silent rebuke. Rachel wrapped the cold pancakes carefully and took them home, unable to simply throw them away, as if doing so would somehow make his absence more permanent. The boy didn't appear the next day either, or the next. A week passed with no sign of him, and Rachel began to wonder if Diane had been right. Had he simply moved on, as strays often did? The thought left her with a hollow ache she couldn't quite explain. She had known nothing about him, not his name, not his story, not even why he chose that particular booth every morning. Yet his absence felt significant, a small light extinguished. "Told you," Diane said on the 10th day of his absence, not unkindly but with the assurance of someone whose worldview had once again been validated. They never stick around once the free ride ends. During this period, Rachel noticed a customer taking photos of the empty booth where she still occasionally left a meal, just in case. The next day, she discovered why. A local Facebook group had shared the images with a mocking caption, "Sunrise Diner now serving imaginary charity cases." The comments were even worse, a cascade of cruelty from people who had never gone hungry, who had never watched someone they cared about disappear without explanation. Publicity stunt. Bet they'll claim the food goes to underprivileged children while throwing it away. Feeding strays just creates dependency. That waitress needs a reality check. Next time a strange kid approaches you, remember this. You're being set up for something. Rachel had never considered herself particularly vulnerable to others' opinions, but the cruelty of these comments stung in unexpected ways. That night, alone in her apartment with the sounds of the pharmacy closing below, she questioned her actions for the first time. Was she foolish to help someone without knowing anything about them? Was she projecting her own past onto a situation she didn't understand? Seeking comfort, she opened the small wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions. Inside lay a faded photograph of her father in his Army medic uniform, his smile gentle despite the harsh desert backdrop. Beside it was the small leather journal he'd carried through his service, the pages worn from frequent handling over the years since his death. Rachel opened it to a dog-eared page, reading the words she knew by heart. Shared half a ration with a local boy today. Johnson said I was crazy, that he'd probably report our position to hostiles. Maybe. But the look in his eyes when he ate, same as mine when Mom would save me the last piece of bread during the hard times. No one grows poor by sharing half a loaf, but those who forget to share remain hungry their whole lives. Rachel traced her finger over her father's handwriting, a sudden clarity washing over her like cold water. She didn't need to know the boy's name or story to recognize hunger, and hunger, whether physical or emotional, asked for bread, not questions. On the morning of the boy's 23rd absence, Rachel arrived at the diner with diminished expectations. The habit of looking toward the door at 7:15 remained, but the sharp anticipation had dulled to quiet resignation. Still, she prepared a small plate of pancakes just in case and placed it at his usual booth, unable to completely abandon hope. At 9:17, everything changed. The first sign was the sudden quiet that fell over the usually bustling diner. Rachel, refilling coffee at a booth near the window, glanced up to see 4 black SUVs with government plates pulling into the small parking lot. They moved with choreographed precision, forming a semicircle in front of the entrance that blocked normal traffic and drew immediate attention from everyone on the street. Customers stopped mid-conversation, forks paused halfway to mouths. Outside, pedestrians slowed to stare as uniformed men emerged from the vehicles, standing at attention beside each door with military precision that suggested something important was happening, something that didn't belong in their small Nebraska town. From the lead SUV stepped a man whose bearing commanded attention before his uniform did. Tall, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much sun and too little peace, he wore the dress uniform of a high-ranking military officer, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons and medals that caught the morning light. He scanned the diner's facade with practiced efficiency before walking purposefully toward the entrance, flanked by 2 younger officers whose expressions remained professionally neutral. The bell above the door chimeras as they entered, the sound unusually loud in the expectant silence. Frank emerged from the back office, straightening his tie nervously, suddenly aware that whatever was happening exceeded his authority and experience. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice higher than usual. The senior officer removed his cap with formal precision. "I'm looking for someone who works here." A woman named Rachel. The diner became so quiet, Rachel could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. All eyes turned toward her as she stepped forward, coffee pot still in hand, feeling exposed and confused and vaguely frightened without understanding why. "I'm Rachel," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the sudden dryness in her throat. The officer's stern expression softened slightly. "Rachel Stevens?" She nodded, setting down the coffee pot before her trembling hands could betray her anxiety. "My name is Colonel Thomas Blake, United States Army Special Forces Command." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew an envelope, crisp and official-looking. "I'm here because of a promise made to one of my men." He extended the envelope toward her. "This is a letter from the Commanding General of Special Forces Operations. And I have a personal message as well, from Daniel's father." "Daniel?" Rachel repeated, the name unfamiliar yet somehow significant, a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling. "The boy you've been feeding for the past several months," Colonel Blake explained, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "Daniel Harper. His father was Sergeant Major Michael Harper, one of the finest soldiers under my command." The past tense landed like a physical weight on Rachel's shoulders. "I don't understand," she said, still not taking the envelope. "Is Daniel okay?" "He's safe," the colonel assured her quickly. "He's with his grandparents now in Montana." But for almost 3 months, he came here every morning before school, after his father was deployed on a classified operation. The pieces began falling into place for Rachel with sickening clarity. The boy's solitude, his watchful carefulness, the hunger that seemed deeper than physical need, the way he positioned himself to see all exits, as if always preparing to run or hide. What Sergeant Major Harper didn't know, the colonel continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, was that his wife had left shortly after his deployment, abandoning Daniel. The boy was too proud, too afraid of being taken from his home and placed in foster care to tell anyone. He managed alone for 3 months, using the small emergency fund his father had left, making meals stretch beyond any reasonable expectation. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the diner. Rachel felt her heart constricting as she imagined Daniel, now with a name, with a story, trying to survive alone, waiting for a father who would never return, managing his fear and hunger with the same careful control he had shown every morning in that corner booth. "Sergeant Major Harper fell in Afghanistan 2 months ago," Colonel Blake said, his voice professional but not without emotion. In his final letter, written 3 days before his death, he wrote that if anything happened to him, we should find and thank the woman named Rachel. At the diner, who fed Daniel without asking questions, he opened the envelope, removing a handwritten note on faded paper that looked like it had been carried in a pocket for a long time. He wrote, "If I don't make it back, please find the person who has been giving my son breakfast. Daniel mentioned her in his letters to me. He said she never asked why he was alone or made him feel ashamed. She just fed him, day after day, expecting nothing. Tell her she didn't just feed a hungry child. She preserved the dignity of a soldier's son." Rachel accepted the letter with trembling hands, tears blurring her vision so that the handwriting swam on the page. The colonel's voice seemed to come from far away as he continued. "The letter was read at Sergeant Major Harper's memorial service. When Daniel finally told us about you, when we understood what you had done for the child of one of our own, without even knowing who he was or why he needed help, the entire Special Forces community made it our mission to find you and thank you in person. What you did," his voice caught briefly before recovering its professional composure, "what you did for the child of one of our own, without even knowing who he was, that means something to all of us. It means everything." The diner had fallen completely silent, the morning sounds of silverware and conversation replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. Colonel Blake straightened to his full height, shoulders back, and snapped to attention with precision that spoke of decades of service. He rendered a formal salute, a gesture of profound respect rarely given to civilians. Behind him, every military person present, the officers who had entered with him, 3 veterans who happened to be having breakfast, even a young soldier in fatigues at the counter, rose and did the same, their movements synchronized not by command, but by shared understanding of what Rachel's actions represented. On behalf of the United States Army Special Forces, the brothers in arms of Sergeant Major Harper, and most importantly, on behalf of Daniel, thank you. Rachel stood frozen, overwhelmed by the knowledge that her simple acts, pancakes and eggs, a glass of milk, a smile without questions, had meant so much to a boy living through unimaginable circumstances, to a father fighting his last battles far from home, perhaps finding peace in knowing his son wasn't completely alone. "I didn't know," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't let him go hungry." The colonel nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes that's enough, Miss Stevens. Sometimes feeding a hungry child without asking why they're hungry is the greatest kindness of all. You didn't need to know Daniel's story. You just needed to see that he was there and that he needed help. That's what Sergeant Major Harper wanted us to tell you." As if on cue, every military person in the room and every soldier standing outside by the vehicles saluted in perfect unison, a wall of respect that seemed to hold Rachel upright when her legs felt uncertain. The customers in the diner, moved by the ceremony unfolding before them, rose to their feet in silent respect, some with tears streaming down their faces. Rachel, the quiet waitress who had lived nearly invisibly for years, stood in the center of it all, clutching a father's last thank you in her hands. A woman whose small daily kindness had preserved not just a child's well-being, but a soldier's honor and peace of mind in his final days, a gift more valuable than any medal or commendation. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the parking lot where the black SUVs waited patiently, a moment of recognition in a small Nebraska town that would be remembered long after the vehicles drove away.